Today's World Insight with Tian Wei.
On this humanitarian effort,
Pyongyang delivers on the pledge to return war remains of the U.S. Bodes well for the momentum of Korean Peninsula diplomacy.
China has been doing very well.
And an exclusive interview with the UN's top peacekeeping official about China's contributions to helping the world's most troubled hotspots. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin our program today in the Korean Peninsula, where the DPRK has returned to the U.S. some of the remains of soldiers killed in the Korean War. The remains were flown to Hawaii after a formal repatriation ceremony held in South Korea on Wednesday. 55 sets of remains were moved from the DPRK on Friday, which happens to be the 65th anniversary of the Korean War armistice. The return is part of the agreement reached between DPRK leader Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump in their Singapore summit on June the 12th. Before we get down to the discussion, here is the latest.
A formal repatriation after 65 years. The 55 sets of remains of troops killed in the 1950-53 war were flown to Hawaii after an official repatriation ceremony held at the American Osan Air Base in South Korea. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence was in Hawaii to receive the remains. Last Friday, a U.S. Air Force C-17 aircraft carried the remains to South Korea from the DPRK's eastern region. A preliminary effort to identify some of the remains had been done in Osan Base, while further processing will be done in Hawaii.
We have many others coming, but I want to thank Chairman Kim in front of the media for fulfilling a promise that he made to me, and I'm sure that he will continue to fulfill that promise as they search and search and search.
Washington and Pyongyang also agreed to restart field operations in the DPRK to search for the estimated 5,300 Americans missing in the war. The transfer of the remains coincided with the 65th anniversary of the 1953 armistice that ended the Korean War, known as the Fatherland Liberation War, in the DPRK. Many analysts say the DPRK hopes, with the goodwill, the U.S. will keep its commitments under the Singapore Agreement.
For more on the DPRK returning U.S. war remains, with us here in Beijing, Zhao Tong, who is an associate at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Welcome, sir, to our program. In Los Angeles, in the U.S., we have Jonathan Pollock, non-resident senior fellow of the John Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. Mr. Pollock, welcome as well. I want to start with you, Mr. Pollock, about the return of the remains. How important it is to open a new page of relations between the United States and the DPRK. After all, that process was pretty much disrupted in quite a few years.
Yes, the return of these remains resumes a process that was interrupted, as I understand it, in 2007. My suspicion would be most of these remains reflect those that were uncovered, literally, in that earlier period of time, rather than something that is a process underway at present. I think that the symbolism of it is very, very important to Americans, and not just Americans. There were many other troops that participated in the Korean War, and it may be that some of these remains belong to other countries as well. So I don't dispute this at all. It is the fulfillment of a promise that was made, a pledge that was made in Singapore. And it could, I emphasize, really restart this process of the recovery of remains.
I see. If we take a look at the history about how many remains of American soldiers during the Korean War have been returned to the United States, a total of 55 sets this time were transported out of the DPRK. However, only one casket contained a dog tag confirming the soldier's identity. Yet, from the year 1996 to 2007, search teams collected 235 sets, with an estimated 5,300 still remains in the DPRK's countryside. Earlier, Mr. Pollock, I understand there is a joint commitment by both the United States and the DPRK to work together inside the DPRK to discover these remains. But during the Bush administration, as a result of the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, that process was disrupted. And now, 11 years later, is there hope that there will be also joint discovery efforts inside the DPRK by both the U.S. and the DPRK? How big is that hope?
Well, I think that there's on the U.S. side, as I understand it, there is encouragement here, but we are at a very, very preliminary point. I think that for a comprehensive effort to locate remains and return remains would involve a very, very complex effort between the United States and North Korea, possibly involving South Korea as well. There will be costs involved with this. My expectation would be that North Korea would insist upon some form of payment to recover these remains, but it would be something, if it were sustained, would be frankly quite unprecedented in the long and tortuous history of this issue. But of course, as you pointed out, the overhang of all of this is questions related to North Korea's nuclear weapons capabilities, which North Korea is trying to keep entirely separate from the issue of the remains.
Right. Mr. Zhao here, I mean, this is an important and very emotional issue, in fact, the return of the remains. Whether that war should be fought at all, it's another debate. But certainly those who have lost their relatives and their beloved ones would love to have their remains going back home. Having said that, though, this is one promise made by the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un during the Singapore summit. Obviously, from this issue alone, Mr. Kim has fulfilled his promise. This is the first stage of it. But on the other hand, what about the promises or the potential promises that the U.S. has made to the DPRK side during the Singapore summit? I wonder whether Pyongyang is thinking about that right now.
Yeah, I agree. The returning of the troop remains was actually one of the 4 points among the Singapore Agreement joint statement. So it's a very important issue, and North Korea has delivered, at least partially. And it's actually the lowest hanging fruit for improving North Korea-US relationship. So I think it's going smoothly, and I'm expecting more progress in the near-term future. I think North Korea, of course, is also expecting some reciprocity of goodwill gesture from Washington. Washington delivered some concessions in the form of rhetorical commitment to suspending future joint exercises. But I think what North Korea wants most at this stage is to fulfill the first 2 points among the 4-point agreement in Singapore, which is firstly to improve further bilateral relationship between Pyongyang and Washington, and secondly to construct a new peace regime over the peninsula. The U.S. of course has apparent hesitation to fulfill these commitments because U.S. worries North Korea will use the ending of the war, the reaching of the new peace treaty as excuse for U.S. to withdraw its troops and to change the nature of the South Korea-U.S. alliance relationship. But I think there are many other things the U.S. can do as a goodwill gesture.
Like what?
To continue the sports diplomacy between U.S. and North Korea.
Right.
And also, U.S. can invite the all-women band to make some performance in the United States. Right?
You're already making proposals.
That's a very low political cost to the United States, but that can be received, I think, very positively in Pyongyang.
Right. Mr. Pollock, do you think that should happen? I mean, the lower hanging fruit, as Mr. Zhao just mentioned, maybe the band performing in the United States, if not ping-pong diplomacy.
Well, I think that the performance of a band or an orchestra would matter to North Korea, because I think its effort here is clearly to try to be treated as as a normal state, if you will. I have not heard of any serious discussion about that. I think that the more interesting point right now, and Zhao Tung has already alluded to this, is that, you know, despite the growing evidence that North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile program are being sustained and enhanced, the Trump administration has done nothing at this point to interrupt the process of diplomatic contact. It's entirely possible that we will see a meeting in Singapore in the next several days between Secretary of State Pompeo and the North Korean Foreign Minister, Lee Yong-ho. So that process continues. I mean, very frankly, the Trump administration has made a big commitment here, if you will, symbolic, perhaps political commitment, from the president himself. He's got a lot on the line here, where he has made all kinds of extravagant claims about what has already been achieved when things have not been achieved.
But the danger here is, Mr. Zhao, that will the DPRK or the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue become the collateral damage of an internal dogfight between the President of the United States and some of the people inside the Beltway who do not necessarily agree with him? If that is the case, it's going to be very tragic. Yet many signs seem to show the era is really going in that direction. Mr. Zhao.
I agree. There is apparent signs of internal disagreement in Washington. In fact, there is constant leaking from the U.S. intelligence community about continued North Korean nuclear and missile activities. That's a sign of the intel community disagreeing with the White House. One important issue for the U.S. to do more homework on is to decide whether U.S. wants to promote an early declaration of the ending of the Korean War. I don't think they have went through comprehensive discussions internally. I don't think there is any thorough interagency process to discuss this issue. And the time is counting, because when the North Korean Foreign Minister Lee Yong-ho meets U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo in Singapore along the on the sideline of the ASEAN regional forum meetings, I think they are going to discuss issues of how to make a political statement to end the war. The U.S. needs to do its homework and make an early decision in order to make progress in Singapore.
Right. When we talk about the division, apparently, between the intelligence agencies and the communities of the United States and the White House, some of the recent information regarding whether DPRK is further its so-called nuclear and missile activities is quite a clear evidence of that. U.S. spy agencies have raised the new suspicions over the DPRK, saying the country is building new missiles. This is according to a Washington Post story quoting anonymous American officials. They say evidence suggests work is underway on at least one, possibly two, intercontinental ballistic missiles at a facility on the outskirts of Pyongyang. The officials said that the missile can also reach the United States. The report casts further doubt on Donald Trump's claims that the DPRK has a change of heart. Of course, I mean, to you, Mr. Zhao, the spy agencies with so-called anonymous source could leak whatever information, whether that is true or not. But the question is whether those information is fake or real. The impact of it is already being felt politically inside the United States about how to deal with the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. Mr. Zhao, in that direction, how do you see this issue would ever be seriously addressed by the current administration and the Washington apparatus?
I think firstly, the leaks by the spy agency can be confirmed independently because there has been thorough research conducted by independent scholars in the United States. For example, the group led by Jeffrey Lewis at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at Monterey, California, they have been using open source satellite images to corroborate the leaks of the intel agency. And they have independently also identified, for example, the North Korean enrichment facility that has been running and continuing to produce enriched uranium. They have identified the facility where Hwasong 15 liquid fueled ICBM missiles are continuing
so your
to
point
be produced.
is?
So I don't think there's a real disagreement about whether the information is authentic. I think it's true that North Korea continues to move forward on those fronts. But I think there is also an increasing consensus formed within the Beltway, which is the next move from Washington should be focusing on how to make North Korea provide a comprehensive inventory of its nuclear missile facilities. I think that's where the hard work is going to be worked on in Singapore.
It is not necessarily just about the DPRK, if I could remind you, Mr. Zhao, because the whole set of agreements in the Singapore summit, which I covered, it's about different responsibilities from both sides to fulfill certain kinds of promises. So if the DPRK is continuing with its missile activities, what the U.S. would do? Meanwhile, if the U.S. is not delivering what it has promised, whether indoor or closed door, what would the DPRK do? And meanwhile, we do not want to forget, Mr. Zhao, this is not about DPRK denuclearization. This is about Korean Peninsula denuclearization, which means the U.S. allies in the Korean Peninsula and around region should also follow exactly what has been promised. So that is a complicated issue than just let's just monitor what the DPRK is doing.
I agree. I think for now, the U.S. is in a very difficult position to deliver what North Korea wants, which is the relaxation of economic sanctions. But I think U.S. can start with something easier, as I said before. It can try to improve further bilateral relations in the area of sports, diplomacy, and inviting more North Korean officials to engage with American counterparts to broaden North Korean national engagement with the outside world. Those are of little risk to the United States, but can be seen in Pyongyang as a good gesture, which can maybe lead to more nuclear concessions from Pyongyang. And by the way, the reason why North Korea is continuing missile and the nuclear activities is because there is no agreement signed yet for North Korea to stop and suspend their missile.
There's no agreement, there's no
production.
blueprint, there's
Right.
no
So
roadmap.
Needs both sides need to work on a concrete agreement.
But is that concrete agreement ever possible? I hate to ask that question over and over again, but really I have to ask that question over and over again because there's no plan, there's no blueprint, there's no roadmap. So what does that mean? It only means this is leaving the Korean Peninsula denuclearization issue out there with full vulnerability. So, Mr. Pollock, before the midterm election, is there any possibility?
Well, I think you've just highlighted some very fundamental considerations that it was because the communique in Singapore was so content-free with respect to anything pertaining to nuclear weapons, that it was all a slogan. It was, if anything, a step backward from the kind of communications in the six-party talks and in subsequent U.S.-North Korean agreements. What we are seeing here is a byproduct of, in effect, you had the commitment to a meeting of the two leaders that was significant in all kinds of ways. It was politically significant for President Trump and obviously for Chairman Kim in all kinds of ways. But again, without the details, without some kind of even a framework within which both sides were agreeing to move forward, it was frankly quite empty.
Right.
And let me emphasize here, the disclosures from the intelligence community are not, I mean, the intelligence community is doing what it is paid to do. They are not participants as such in the policymaking process. I would emphasize here, senior officials in the Trump administration, including Secretary of State Pompeo and National Security Advisor Bolton, have been saying things very different from what they have said in the past. In the past, they were insistent immediately on comprehensive, verifiable agreement. They're now seemingly recognizing that whatever is going to happen is going to be a very protracted process, which frankly sounds a lot like what previous administrations have done. So when you ask about what the impact of this could be on the election, I don't think it's decisive in any sense, but President Trump
I'm not saying that this will have an impact on the election. I'm saying what the election, possible election, will have its impact on this possible deal about making a blueprint. Having said that, though, there's the issue whether the United States is still viable in the whole discussion. Of course, eventually the U.S. has to be one of those important parties that has to make itself viable. Otherwise, the issue cannot be resolved. But it seems that the South Korea has much exceeded the United States in playing a more significant role in approaching the DPRK. South Korea and the DPRK have started high-level military talks aimed at easing tensions as agreed during the April summit between the leaders from the North and the South. South Korea is set to begin a 12 phase of removing troops and equipment from the 60 outposts it maintains with the demilitarized zone and expect Pyongyang to do the same at its 160 outposts. Discussion about disarming the joint security area also on the agenda. Meanwhile, high-ranking Blue House officials said an official and the Korean War may require China's involvement, highlighting the importance of China in denuclearization process. South Korea also expected a peace deal by the end of the year. Of course, that's all expectations coming from South Korea. But the question is, will the United States still be a player in this process at all? Let's just say before the year end. Are we going to see this zigzagging thing, this, empty talks, and this inside dogfighting going on in Washington, which has nothing to do with what we're really talking about, which is denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula? Mr. Pollock.
Tianwei, I do not see evidence at this point that there is a big internal battle within the Trump administration. It is more voices from outside. And so your point, for example, about the congressional elections in November, if the Democrats regain control of the House, it's much more difficult to imagine them regaining control of the Senate, although it's still too soon to say. You can safely assume that a Democratic majority will hold the Trump administration's feet to the fire. There will be much more criticism here if there is not demonstrable movement in favor of real meaningful progress on the question of North Korea's nuclear and missile programs.
Well, so Democrats were in the White House earlier, but it didn't see the Democrats really delivered much. Having said that, I want to come back to you, to Mr. Zhao here in China. So China's role should also be important. But at the time when you have almost a deadlock between Pyongyang and Washington, even though better than before, what can China do once again? And also South Korea becoming very active in playing its role in at least mending the fences with the DPRK, trying to speed up as much as possible before it gets really cold. Because we all remember that moment, right? We remember after rounds of six-party talks, things just not happening. So, Mr. Zhao, who will be the significant players in pushing the agenda to the next stage?
I think certainly South Korea is reasserting its role over this process, and there is this internal debate between the alliance. South Korea is making a much stronger voice, promoting an early political declaration of the end of the war. And I think that's where China can contribute. China also wants to see a political ending of the war, a political declaration on that effect to happen as soon as possible. And China wants to be involved to make it a four-party political declaration.
Right.
But I think it's also true that in China there is serious internal debate. Many people actually argue that North Korea is likely to completely denuclearize as long as U.S. shows sincere willingness to offer security guarantee. I personally disagree with that. I think North Korea's nuclear weapons are going to stay, and therefore I think the near-term efforts by China should focus on avoiding North Korean nuclear issue from escalating into bilateral issues between China and South Korea and between China and Japan. because recently, for example, Japan starts to deploy more advanced missile defense systems.
This
in
is what we're
region.
talking about,
Right.
denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, not just DPRK itself. So, Mr. Zhao, if I could ask you about that, though, you see the geopolitical situation in the Asia-Pacific region is changing dramatically as we speak. Whether you talk about the trade war, you talk about the long-term possibility of Cold War, these are not just empty discussions anymore. So what do you think? How the DPRK and also Korean Peninsula denuclearization issue be played out in this much bigger context? Very briefly from you before we go to Mr. Pollock.
Yeah, I think this process of denuclearization is going to be a long, very long process, probably decades long. So China should be prepared to deal with near-term implications, to try to stabilize its own relationship with the United States, with South Korea, Japan, and other neighbors, and to prevent this nuclear crisis from undermining the overall stability in this region. That's the near-term priority for China, I think.
Mr. Pollock, we only have 1 minute to go. Well, China could try to do all of these things, but the thing is whether the United States would play along with China, do that tango, is another question.
It is, Tianwei, and I understand there are some reports that there will be a renewal of discussions, consultations about trade issues between the United States and China. I think
we haven't heard about that.
We are at a
there are so many mixed messages coming out.
Yeah, no, we have not. Right, that's life in Washington, D.C., and maybe in Beijing as well. And I think that fundamentally, unless the United States and China have a credible way in which they can communicate and cooperate, all these tensions and differences will only create running room for North Korea, which wants to be relieved of pressure, wants to have more latitude to do what it chooses to do, and wants, frankly, acceptance as a nuclear weapons state. And unless the U.S. and China can speak with a common voice here, we are headed into some very, very troubled waters.
Is there some common voice still left that people would really wonder during this very complicated period of time? For now, I want to thank the two of you for being with us, Jonathan Pollock and Zhao Tong. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you so much. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tianwei. Still to come on our program, a chat with the UN top peacekeeping official about China's efforts to bring peace to the world's most troubled hotspots. Right after this break.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington, and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms, and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tianwei go beyond the headlines.
You're watching breaking news on CGTN.
Hello and welcome back to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. August the 1st is China's Army Day. This year marks the 91st anniversary of the founding of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, or the PLA. Speaking before the event, Chinese President Xi Jinping, who is also the chairman of the Central Military Commission, called on the nation's military to stop all paid services. The president says the move is an important part of China's new round of military reforms. He stressed that the PLA would continue to work to preserve world peace and uphold the international order.
The call to action can come at any time. There's an unannounced drill every week. Their rapid response exercise is to prepare troops for any possible scenario. This is the daily life of UN peacekeepers. Protecting civilians and impartiality are the core principles. Participating in UN-led peacekeeping missions since 1990, China has made a series of historic leaps in its peacekeeping efforts. More than 30,000 officers and soldiers take part in more than 20 peacekeeping missions. In a significant move in 2015, China announced it would set up a permanent UN peacekeeping force of 8,000 troops and donate $100 million to the African Union.
Africa has the biggest peacekeeping needs. In the long run, the international community and the UN should support African countries in increasing their own capacity in keeping peace and stability so that African issues can be addressed in an African way.
In 2016, 3 Chinese UN peacekeepers died on missions. But that did not deter China's participation in UN peacekeeping operations. Keeping peace, bringing hope, better life to people in need is every peacekeeper's aspiration.
The PLA will, as always, actively perform its responsibilities and obligations compatible with its international status and make positive contributions to the building of a community of shared future for mankind.
China has been sending peacekeepers to various hotspots around the world as part of China's peacekeeping commitment to the United Nations. Such units usually include engineers and logistical units and members of the paramilitary People's Armed Police. They have been deployed as part of peacekeeping operations in Africa and the Middle East on behalf of the UN. Earlier, I asked Atul Kher, who is the UN Under-Secretary General for Field Support, about China's contribution to the UN efforts. He is responsible for the logistical support of UN peacekeeping services worldwide, and he provides the most accurate description of China's peacekeeping contributions so far.
China is in a very unique position. It is the only country which is a permanent member of the Security Council, which authorizes peacekeeping operations. It is the country which at the same point of time is also amongst the top 10 troop contributing nations, and with about 10.2% of its contribution to the entire budget of peacekeeping, it is the second largest financial contributor to the peacekeeping operations. There is no other country in the world which is within the top 10 financial contributors, within the top 10 troop contributors, and also a permanent member of the Security Council. This is a unique position with unique responsibilities, and China has been doing very well. We are happy with its contributions of military liaison officers, of medical officers, of hospitals, level 1 and level 2, of engineering companies, and of course the police formed units and individual police officers. All of them have been doing very well.
But there are different interpretations as to why China wants to do that from different parts of the world. What do you make of these diversified voices concerning what China wants?
I don't know about the diversified voices, but you know, the Charter of the United Nations imposes a responsibility on all its member states to contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security. And this responsibility obviously is greater for the members of the Security Council. As a permanent member of the Security Council, I think China is playing its rightful role in contributing to the maintenance of international peace and security, and we are grateful for the Chinese contributions.
Sometimes peacekeeping are having the problems of no peace to be kept.
Correct.
So that has a lot to do with the evolving role of the peacekeeping of the United Nations.
Absolutely.
And what should be the groundwork laid before that?
Yeah.
What do you make of all of these recent developments?
The fact that we are now deployed in countries which are facing internal conflict, where peace does not yet exist, and where terrorists continue to operate along the sidelines of peacekeepers. I think these are new and difficult emerging challenges which require us to think together as the international community, through the Security Council, through giving mandates which are clear, through ensuring that the political processes also produce results, while at the same point of time the military peacekeepers provide a blanket of security, a framework within which the political process can unfold.
We see a lot of conflicting points these days in the world.
Yes.
Of course, inside Europe you have the migrant issue, and in the Middle East there are so many traditional and new added problems. How much role do you think peacekeeping can play its role practically?
You know, currently the operations which are supported by my department, that is both the special political missions, the peacekeeping operations and the African Union operations, they are deployed in 36 places in 30 countries in the world. I don't think we should expand them too much.
It's already stretched thin.
It's already stretched to the limit. What we need to do is to enhance the effectiveness, the efficiency of the peacekeepers, to ensure greater security and safety of the peacekeepers. You know, we unfortunately lost 3 valiant, courageous Chinese peacekeepers, and I pay tribute to their memory. One person lost his life in Mali and 2 others in South Sudan. I think therefore safety and security of peacekeepers, greater effectiveness and greater efficiency should be our motto for tomorrow.
But how can you do that? I mean, it's very important for U.S. policymakers to think about these, but how to implement it? How to have the cooperation of the ground, the countries involved.
Yes.
That's the most important thing.
And I think this happens essentially through various discussions that we organize in United Nations. Practically every speaker called for enhanced resources to be provided to the UN peacekeeping. This was a matter of deep satisfaction to me because they acknowledged the challenges which we are facing.
Now we see the UN is changing in a fast-changing world. What would you expect the future direction of peacekeeping by the UN? And what will that be, the job division between the United Nations and the regional powers and individual countries?
I think maintenance of international peace and security in today's volatile world requires the fullest degree of cooperation and understanding between regional organizations, sub-regional organizations and United Nations. I think it is only by working together that we can produce results, which is why over the last 2 years I have greatly enhanced the cooperation which exists between the United Nations, my department particularly, and the African Union. We are also similarly enhancing the cooperation with the European Union and in due course of time with ASEAN or other regional organizations of the world.
What are the realistic expectations the UN should have about China?
I think the realistic expectations are the fulfillment of the pledges which were announced by His Excellency President Xi Jinping in the Peacekeeping Leaders Summit in September 2015. And I will divide these pledges into 3 broad categories. First is the contribution which the China will make through its troops, through its equipment. We have already conducted an assessment visit for a rapidly deployable formed police unit. As we speak, my team is doing an assessment of their equipment so that we can place them in what is known as level 3, beyond level 1 and level 2. Level 3 means that they are most ready to deploy.
I see.
So it's a question of time period of deployment rather than the dangerous places. Second, is the contribution which China will make towards the development of peacekeepers from other countries. You know, it was promised that China will train about 2,000 peacekeepers from different countries, and we look forward to that, because as I told you earlier, every UN member state has a responsibility to contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security, but sometimes they are unable to do it because either they are lacking the skills and training or they are lacking the equipment. And I discussed both these issues with the Chinese leaders during my visit. And third, of course, is support to the Africa for its own peacekeeping, and as you know, there was an announcement of $100 million being made available to African Union peacekeeping, and we look forward to the implementation of that pledge. Similarly, we will do studies for other brigade, the Vanguard Brigade, which China supports, and we hope that in due course of time, China can provide us with military helicopters, including armed helicopters, with transport helicopters, utility aviation helicopters, and so on.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insights CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us Twitter, Facebook, Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.